Geography is a very important issue in community health assessment. You may recall when defining a community, there were various ways that communities can be defined. It can be based on some characteristic of the people in the community. It usually is one, either a characteristic or group of characteristics. It could deal with where they seek their medical care. It could deal with their some sort of income range, etc. But the most common way that communities are defined for the purposes of community health assessment is, in fact, by geography, where they live. And that's typically some sort of a well-defined jurisdiction that has either some legal or administrative status. And in order to introduce you to some of the ways in which geographic areas are defined in the United States, we are going to talk in this set of slides about the standard hierarchy of the U.S. Census and how it defines geographic entities. The way in which the census defines geographic entities is used by many people for various purposes, both political purposes, for government purposes, as well as business purposes. So it's a very common way in which one will find geographic areas defined. This slide here is sort of a visual depiction of the geographic entities defined by the census. The nation is at the top, i.e. the United States. The census then has regions, divisions, which it defines. These are groupings of states within the United States. Then under divisions, there are states themselves, of course, 50 states, the District of Columbia. And then within states, most states have counties or county equivalents, as well as, and you'll see off to the left, some other kinds of county subdivisions that are important, that will be important for the purposes of community health assessment. Then census tracts are listed next. Those are all, those are a subset of counties themselves, or defined within counties, and then those in turn can be divided further into block groups and census blocks. You'll notice there are other ways in which geography can be defined. Zip code is a common one that you may be familiar with, and it can in fact cross county or state boundaries. That's why it sits over to the left on the outside and isn't drawn directly either from states or counties. School districts and congressional districts are within given states, although they may cross county boundaries. So those are examples. The next slide actually gives a list of the geographic entities defined in the 1990 census, which are similar to those still used now in both the 2000 and 2010 census. The listing in the first column of types is similar to what we just looked at. The status tells you whether each particular entity has a legal status, or is it mainly a statistical or administrative status. So for example, the nation, the United States, is defined as a legal entity, as are states and counties, but the regions and divisions in the United States are defined for statistical purposes for the Census Bureau. The final column, number, tells how many of each of these entities there are in the United States. So for example, there's one nation. There are 57 states or statistically equivalent entities, and there are 3,248 counties or equivalents. Counties themselves can be further subdivided in several different ways depending on where you are in the country. There can be things known as minor civil divisions within the counties. These may be towns or other areas that are defined for legal purposes. In other words, they may have their own government, their own way of dealing with it. New England tends to have towns, for example, whereas further in the West, those are not necessarily recognized. But there are a lot of them in the United States, some 30,000 or so. We see incorporated places. There are a lot of those, 19,000 of those in the United States. So these are just some other examples of ways in which counties can be subdivided. Here are some actual definitions of terms. Let's go through them quickly. Minor civil divisions, we just discussed this briefly in the previous slide, are the primary governmental or administrative divisions of a county in 29 states that are created to provide services or administer an area without regard necessarily to population. Again, I mentioned this as one possible way that things are divided up in some states. Incorporated places are legally in existence as of January 1st, 2010, and are established to provide governmental functions to a population. So the minor civil divisions may or may not be set up to deal specifically with a population, whereas the incorporated places typically are, and they provide governmental functions to a population. Incorporated places are always within a single state, but they may extend across county and county subdivision boundaries. An incorporated place usually is a city, town, village, or borough. For Census Bureau purposes, the incorporated places exclude the boroughs in Alaska, towns in New England, and boroughs in New York. Just let me focus on this because many of you may be from New England. Towns in New England are actually viewed as minor civil divisions up above. There are some towns in New England which contain virtually no population. Here are a few more specific kinds of geographical entities which were shown in the figure on the second slide in this group. For example, metropolitan statistical areas are designated by the census in order to look at large metropolitan urban areas, for example, surrounding the Atlanta, Georgia metropolitan statistical area or the New York City metropolitan statistical area. There are also congressional districts that have a legal basis. There are 435 of those. School districts are for administrative purposes, for administering school systems. Zip codes are listed here too. For mail purposes, there are roughly 40,000 of those. And finally, there are census tracts and block numbering areas. We'll look at that in just a moment on the next couple of slides. So here is a figure that shows the small area geography. In other words, now we're down at the level of a county and below, typically. So in the first figure here, the first order subdivision, typically a county, is this bounded by this area here. Within it are minor civil divisions listed here. Then there might be within this county two separate census tracts, tract 9501 and 9502. Down below here is the census tract 9502, which is in fact further subdivided into block numbering areas, which are these numbers here. Then a group of those block numbering areas may be composed as a block group here. You can see this particular grouping. And then individual blocks here is the lowest level of small area geography used by the census, and a block might be bounded by say 2 or 3 streets, or 2 streets and a county boundary, for example. There also can be, under a minor civil division, there could be a place that's identified within that minor civil division, which itself might be composed of a series of blocks, and then, as we showed before, one of those blocks is represented down here. So this again is just a way in which the smaller areas are defined within the by the census, and this is useful because data for places can be tied to these small areas. This slide talks a bit about the census tracts in particular and gives some of their characteristics. They are small, relatively permanent statistical subdivisions of a county or equivalent. They are intended to provide a stable set of geographic units for the presentation of statistical data. They usually have a population size between about 1,200 and 8,000 people, optimally being around 4,000 people. And you can read the remainder of these attributes. Finally, there are a few additional entities that were defined in the 1990 census that relate to American Indians and Alaska Natives, and these are listed here. There are American Indian reservations, for example, that have a legal definition, as well as American Indian land trusts. There are also statistical areas within these areas as well. So that is a quick overview of some of the geographic entities used by the Bureau of the Census in the United States, and some of these entities are useful in terms of defining communities for the purpose of community health assessments and for conducting community health profiles.